young, for example. It's true. Peter Thiel having a significant interest in injecting young people's blood into themselves to stay young, for example. It's true. And the SINS Research Foundation is focused on using biotech, including mRNA, DNA vaccines, and technology like that in order to allegedly extend people's lifespans. Which is the SINS Research Foundation is also really exists thanks to the financing of Thiel as well. So it's no surprise that you have a lot of people affiliated with Thiel present there, like O'Neill, also Blake Masters, who's sort of like a JD Vance type of Thiel creation, whose failed political career was also bankrolled by Thiel. And he was on the SINS Research Foundation with O'Neill for some time. And they're focused on a lot of that kind of angle of biotech as well. And I think it's fair to sort of look, I mean, people need to pay attention to a lot of the Silicon Valley big tech and big pharma overlap. I've been covering it a lot since the COVID era. But basically there's been this effort, and you covered it in your piece about the WHO and permanent pandemic markets, this idea of the traditional income model for big pharma has basically run out of steam. It's been telegraphed openly by big pharma itself. They refer to it as the patent cliff issue. And so the way they want to get around patent cliffs, which is basically related to how products go generic and they don't make as much money when they're not exclusive products of that pharmaceutical company anymore. They've been going into biotech, and a lot of that is through joint ventures with big tech companies like Google, for example. And, a lot of those companies also now double as major and essential parts of the national security state, and national security state contractors, and integral parts of the national security, mass surveillance apparatus. And so the idea of having a lot of this, this idea of selling biosurveillance and all of this is a way to improve, market response to healthcare products and all of this stuff, I would argue is really kind of a sly way to manufacture what I think is pretty openly acknowledged as the final frontier of mass surveillance, which is surveilling people's bodies through wearables and eventually through things inside the body, nanomedicines. And of course, I would put brain computer interfaces, BCIs like Neuralink, in that category. And I think it's important to remember too, with brain machine interfaces or BCIs, that it ultimately comes to the FDA to approve them. FDA tends to grant them breakthrough device status, which sort of waives some of the quote unquote regulatory red tape for these things. But we have, Elon Musk having a very prominent role in the government right now. He doesn't have to divest from any of his companies at all in that role. And neither does another PayPal mafia figure who's also now a special government employee, David Sachs, the crypto AI czar. And as crypto AI czar, it's very possible he could partner with someone like O'Neill, who is also a very big advocate for AI in healthcare, and see some of the stuff expanded as well. And I would definitely encourage people to pay attention to how this could potentially advance, because it has very Orwellian possibilities if they are collecting not just our data from our external activities and our external environment. There's this really crazy push to surveil everything and sort of mine all the data possible. You have companies tied to the current administration, for example, creating the Internet of Forests, trying to hook up every tree in the Amazon rainforest to mine biodata out of rainforest trees. It sounds bonkers, but there's ambitions to do that to people as well, and create the so-called Internet of Bodies, which military contractors and think tanks like the Rand Corporation have been writing about for years. And it's really not. I mean, I think Purdue or some other university like that recently created a whole center dedicated to accelerating the development of the Internet of Bodies. Silicon Valley has been pushing the wearable agenda for some time, and I think we could potentially see the push for that come through, under the guise of health. Initially it was like, look how cool Google glasses are, and look at my VR Apple helmet. And now I guess Facebook has made these like Ray-Ban looking ones that they think will not look as insane on people.
Yeah, my friend has a pair and they look completely stupid.
Yeah, you should break them for him. Do him a favor. Be like, hey, did you know Facebook started as a DARPA project? Can I borrow those for a second and take them to the garage? I don't know. Sorry. Getting a little too opinionated there. But anyway, this really is an ambition of that. And I think, when you have someone like Larry Ellison of Oracle, who was previously contracted to biosurveil COVID-19 vaccine recipients, coming out and saying we're going to have all these AI personalized cancer vaccines, they're going to be personalized. They're going to have to gather the testing data on you after you receive them. And they may not do the same method they did with COVID-19 with like blanket mandates, but it's very possible there will be some other type of coercive measure to try and get people to adopt this, because a big theme, whether it's healthcare or really anything else, like I mentioned earlier in reference to the SDGs, is about creating new markets that will make, this oligarch class very wealthy and entrench their power, and sort of lead to this neo-feudalism in society. And I think this is one of those, ways they could do that, because the only way they can get people to want these products is to create, use public policy as the enabling environment for these markets, essentially. So it's kind of crazy, honestly, to see a lot of the mental gymnastics that have been used to sort of explain away the Stargate announcement, or Lutnick's comment about buying the U.S. government now buying equity in COVID-19 mRNA vaccine companies, or any of the other things we've discussed today. Even when our article came out on Jim O'Neill and his potential to undermine, a lot of these early Maha ambitions, pretty much crickets from a lot of the big influencers in that movement, which honestly, is kind of telling in itself as well. But also just a very little interest in addressing Palantir really at all. And Palantir, of course, is a company that has expanded under every administration. It's a bipartisan, it's the engine on which the quote unquote deep state runs. But yet no one in this administration or, its supporters really wants to talk about Palantir really very much at all. And how many investors in Palantir, O'Neill included, but also, people like Joe Lonsdale was a major donor to Trump. David Sachs is also an investor in Palantir. He's the crypto AI czar. And of course, Peter Thiel co-founded Palantir. And Palantir has numerous contracts with the U.S. military, and other, every 18 intelligence, all 18 of the U.S. intelligence agencies, also very involved in Ukraine, which Kennedy was a big critic of, as well as the genocide in Gaza, which RFK, of course, is not a critic of. But nevertheless, Palantir has become kind of ubiquitous today. They also run a lot of the data for the British NHS, National Health Service, and they also run it for HHS, which I know you covered recently on your piece about the Palantir-run Center for Forecasting and Outbreak Analysis at the CDC. And I think that's worth covering a little bit here too, as we try and wrap up here, to talk about sort of how, a new paradigm, if there's a new quote unquote public health emergency, how lockdowns or any of these other measures that became infamous during COVID might be implemented quote unquote more gently, as a way to make people think that, there's been an improvement over past, after post-COVID, when in reality, a lot of these same tactics that are sort of very probable in a future pandemic scenario were really tested out during COVID to a significant extent.
Yeah, and just like I'll get into the bigger picture CFA, Center for Forecasting and Outbreak Analytics, the Palantir run CDC program you just mentioned in a second, the bigger picture stuff. But just like regarding that comment you made about nano chips, I think, and Musk Neuralink. A lot of times when I bring that up to people, I think they kind of roll their eyes and they're like, this sounds ridiculous. Like, this is sci-fi at this point. But like, so just for example, the Center for Forecasting and Outbreak Analytics, they have this thing called the Innovate branch. And that's responsible for collaborating with, quote, academic, private sector, and interagency partners as part of its goal to create products, tools, and enterprise enhancements in order to make pandemic data analysis flexible, fast, and scalable for CFA customers, including state, tribal, local authorities. And right now, take note of that line where it says that they're working with interagency partners to create products and tools and enterprise enhancements to make this data sharing more vast and flexible. We noted in our article on Jim O'Neill that ARPA-H, that program that we mentioned earlier, that was initially a pre-crime program, is actually creating a device. So they commissioned 4 different teams to develop bioelectronic devices to be implanted in patients through minor outpatient surgery. So that's literally from the ARPA-H website. That's not me talking, that's them.
Yeah.
And one team is aiming to create a living sentinel, is what they call it, to measure key biomarkers in the body and monitor their bodily conditions in real time. And then all of the teams are aiming to develop an implantable living pharmacy programmed to deliver therapeutic molecules to the patient on demand for an extended period. So,
okay, great.
Yeah. Right there. So right there, you have this thing that's going to, I guess, automatically feed you these therapeutic, maybe even
they're therapeutic. Don't ask what the molecules are. It's
right.
It's therapeutic. It's like going to the spa.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And it's made just for you, right? Because now they have this thing to constantly collect data from.
They got a lot of people's DNA through COVID vaccine testing, and Palantir took all of that data.
Right. And now they want to get more of it, I guess, because they want to create a living sentinel to constantly analyze your genealogy.
They want to mine people constantly for biodata and have the AI constantly awash in data that our bodies generate, because data is the new oil. So you have to tap every possible source you can for data. And the best way to generate data is to continually extract it from something that's alive. So that's why I think, we're having a lot of this push into Internet of Bodies, the Internet of Forests, and all of these things, because the parameters of a living thing are constantly in flux, right? Because it's alive, it's not inert. And so you can generate a lot of data and the more successful your AI will become is determined by how much data it's feeding on, and also the quality of that data, right? So I think that's one of the incentives here. And again, I think people might sort of be ignoring brain-machine interfaces at their own risk, because there are a considerable amount of ties to that industry from this administration. So again, obviously Elon Musk is probably the most obvious because of Neuralink. Which has had a lot of controversies over the amount of animals that died during their animal trials, for example. And if the FDA under Trump is very amenable to BCIs, we could see them potentially commercialized over the next 4 years. Because again, those are devices that have to undergo FDA approval in order to go on the market. But there's several companies that are farther along than Neuralink are. One of those is BlackRock Neurotech, which recently received a very significant investment from the stablecoin issuer Tether, which has a lot of ties to Howard Lutnick, the Secretary of Commerce. And Tether, of course, is also very much connected to Rumble. Rumble, of course, also tied to Howard Lutnick, also tied to J.D. Vance, the vice president, and Peter Thiel. And their general counsel just became the number 2 guy at the CIA, Michael Ellis. And then they're also connected to Tether also invested really heavily in this firm called Satellogic, which is a satellite surveillance company that's involved in, they're building the Internet of Forests, for example, for the purpose of turning each hectare of the Amazon into basically like a token that you can buy. It sounds totally insane, but it's true.
And Satellogic is also kind of connected. It's directly connected to Palantir because they have a 5-year partnership, right?
Yes, they're contracting with Palantir right now, and Lutnick is on the board of that one. And Steve Mnuchin, who was Treasury Secretary during Trump's first term, is the chairman of the board. So it's interesting that you have people like Musk doing sort of this satellite digital finance and brain chip play, and you have Tether basically replicating that play. And they both have significant ties to the government, and they would, a lot of the companies in that web need government approval in order to get their products on the market. I don't know. That seems like a disturbing setup for Internet of bodies stuff going forward. And I think there's going to be a lot of different ways this stuff is sold to a reluctant audience, which would be Trump's base, I think, but probably not exclusively Trump's base. I think there's plenty of people on the left that are not really interested in this stuff either. But though I've already sort of seen people sort of in the Trump supporting sphere say things like mRNA is fine as long as there's no mandates, and sort of kind of changing the realm of discussion a little bit already, or we can't hinder innovation. And a lot of the, of course, celebrity worship of people like Elon. I think, there's people like Tim Pool that have tweeted very supportively of Neuralink press releases, being like, Neuralink, let's go. So I mean it's very possible we could see more of that. And then I don't know, I don't know exactly how they're going to get people to use that stuff, but I think they won't have any problem getting it through FDA approval under this administration.
Yeah, I mean, like, it seems like the go-to strategy for big capital or big business is basic. I mean, it's the national security strategy. It's the creating these phantom enemies. I'm reading this book right now called "Drug Cartels Do Not Exist" by Oswald. I don't remember the author's name actually, but he talks about the creation of a phantom enemy or something. Basically, this ever-changing thing. And I mean,
Yeah, invisible enemies.
yeah, and basically that seems to be the strategy for kind of everything that they want to do that would normally be met with skepticism by the public, and it kind of tends to work. I mean, like when the internet was first coming out, it was recognized as a tool of surveillance by the military-industrial complex, and there was actually a lot of resistance that the military meant when they were trying to utilize universities like MIT and other places to develop this stuff by the student body that was, radical and anti-war at the time. And now it's, no one really cares. I was telling my friends about this Center for Forecasting and Outbreak Analytics piece that I wrote for your website for Unlimited Hangout. And, I told them, oh, well, it's this thing where there's this apparatus between big healthcare and Silicon Valley, and they're trying to predict disease outbreaks before they occur so that they can develop procured policy that's specified at certain communities to lock them down. And then my friend said, isn't that a good thing? And I was like, well,
they'll sell it as a good thing. They'll be like, well, here we go. We don't have to lock down the whole country. We only have to lock down the areas that need to be locked down.
Right, exactly. And then that's the pitch, I guess, for kind of everyone, but specifically at those like people that were skeptical of the more universal style non-pharmaceutical intervention policies during COVID-19. Well, now it's more objective, and it's just the people that need to get shut down, right? But the thing that I think is really important, worth noting regarding the Center for Forecasting and Outbreak Analytics and Palantir's role in it. Basically, the Center for Forecasting and Outbreak Analytics seems to be the office that is dedicated to carrying out what the CDC calls its common operating picture, where they want to create this consortium of academic, private sector, and interagency partners dedicated to constantly analyzing and collecting bio data to predict pandemic outbreaks and correspondingly prepare and respond for them when they happen or may happen. And the Center for Forecasting and that strategy of doing that actually comes out from the Total Information Awareness Program, which you've covered extensively. You can probably get into
probably too much. Yes.
Yeah, and that's important because the Total Information Awareness Program, at its core, was a pre-crime program, and it's sought to tap things like financial records, and I mean, at the time,
everything.
Yeah,
everything about you.
Everything that was available at the time.
Total. They really meant it.
Yeah. At the time, I don't think that they really had Apple Watches and Fitbits and iPhones.
They wanted them, and they got them now.
Yeah, and to stop terrorism before it happened. And I mean, you could see that, like, if you go back, I can't think of.
But these ideas are not old. When Trump was in office the last time, he called on Silicon Valley to develop software to detect mass shooters before they strike. And then you had the HARPA program that his administration was considering, basically offering to do that by running, a social media post through AI to determine which Americans show early warning signs of neuropsychiatric violence, which probably would be literally everyone on Twitter. But
Yeah, and then Peter Thiel with that company. I can't remember his exact involvement. I think he's an investor in it, or it was a seed fund or something. Clearview AI actually scanned.
Main investor. Mm-hmm.
Right, main investor actually did that exact strategy. Scouring social media, I think via AI,
Yes.
to track down people that were at the January 6th protests and arrest them. And a lot of those people were, like, I mean, there's still a lot that are awaiting trial, I think. Well, I think Trump just pardoned them, actually, but up until recently, at least.
Well, they bragged about using facial recognition to have those people arrested by law enforcement.
Yeah, right.
And that's what people don't realize, is that this is really an outgrowth of the war on domestic terror. There are explicit efforts said by Bill Gates, but also maybe tech billionaires you don't hate, about combining national security with health security. And that is why Palantir is running it for the national security state, and they're also running it for HHS. The goal is to fuse those two things into one thing. And the way they'll probably do it, or the easiest way for them to manufacture consent for that, is what they tried to do with the 2001 anthrax attacks, and talk about bioterror. And, there was sort of efforts to seed these kind of narratives in early COVID-19. Neo-Nazis are licking doorknobs and giving people COVID. That was literally like stories that happened. Those were real stories, used to sort of fearmonger this type of stuff. And I think, they may try and, they're not a creative bunch. They like to recycle a lot of their narratives and their old playbooks. Look no further than the Sean Ryan show for proof of that. But I think people should be very cognizant of this stuff, because it's going to be framed as a win. They will say, oh, we only have to lock down this community and that community, and not the whole country. And people that criticize the COVID response, I'm sure many of them will applaud it. But the problem is, this was actually tested out during COVID-19 itself, basically the Israeli equivalent of Palantir as it relates to COVID-19 response. And I say that in the context of Palantir's contract with Operation Warp Speed. But the Israeli equivalent of that in the COVID-19 era was this firm called Diagnostic Robotics. And they were given a contract to basically predict COVID outbreaks in Rhode Island before they happen by then Governor of Rhode Island, Gina Raimondo, who later became Biden's Commerce Secretary. And this firm, if you believe their own numbers that they put out in like their PR leaflets and stuff, say that their algorithm is 75% accurate, and that's not audited. So we could assume that it's probably lower than what they publicly profess in their sales pitch. So maybe it's 60%, maybe it's 50%. I don't know. But that's getting dangerously close, or in the case of 50%, literally is the same as a coin toss. Right. So you're deciding to either shut down entire local economies based on an algorithm that is not 100% accurate. So I would argue that isn't better. You're still taking away people's civil liberties based on faulty data. And if it's about, using AI algorithms that aren't accurate either, and notoriously racially biased, to be like, this ethnic minority needs the shot and this one doesn't, which is exactly what Palantir did under Operation Warp Speed. That's what their Tiberius program literally was about. It definitely becomes very Orwellian. And so maybe it's not collective punishment, maybe in the same way as during the COVID-19 era. But this is ultimately this idea of sort of personalizing things, whether it's personalized COVID vaccines or personalized, localized pandemic response. This was the goal. And a lot of this stuff, as I noted during the COVID era, the antecedents of it were all sort of dreamt up and first attempted, in the immediate post 9/11 era. I don't know. It seems like a lot of those programs have not gone away. And actually, a lot of the total information awareness programs, they were specifically called surveillance. And some of them included, surveilling wastewater to prevent disease before it happens. And that was literally a program that was launched during COVID, and that Palantir runs. And I've argued in my work that Palantir is just the privatized version of total information awareness, because Peter Thiel and Alex Karp went to the guy running total information awareness and were basically like, tell us what to do because we want to make this a private company now that you're being defunded by Congress. And then get all this money from the CIA and the top people at the CIA that were working on total information awareness with the DARPA people and John Poindexter become the main funders of Palantir with Peter Thiel. I mean, I don't know. But I should say, in the context of the PayPal presidency theme, that Palantir itself started off as the anti-fraud algorithm at PayPal, and PayPal itself as a company started as a consequence of its founders having extensive conversations with every three-letter agency that would talk to them. That's according to PayPal co-founder Max Levchin. So, who gave a spirited defense of NSA warrantless spying in the Snowden era. So much for that whole libertarian veneer of the PayPal crowd. But it's fine.
And, like you're talking about these models that are going to be dictating curated policy for at least communities, maybe individuals. One of the things that the Center for Forecasting and Outbreak Analytics plans to do with this biodata is use it to dictate the community migration rights of communities. So basically, like where you can go and enter. I'm presuming they don't specify exactly.
Yeah, the whole, oh no, that sounds a lot like what Trump supporters were calling 15-minute cities not that long ago.
Right. Yeah.
Hey, but it's our elites that are running it, Max.
Yeah.
Our elites are going to run it.
Yeah. Barry Weiss did an episode with Peter Thiel, and she was like, and I forgot exactly what it was.
The counter
like
elites.
The counter, yeah.
Yes, they're so different.
yeah, evidenced by Elon Musk taking over. I can't remember the name of the government department, and then actually talking with Google DeepMind AI to basically take over, to start helping dictate which departments to cut and everything. So they're totally different, all these people. And like regarding like this inaccuracy, that these hallucinations, I guess, that you could call the AI experiences where they aren't correct a lot of the time. I mean, just for example, how like even these chat bot ones are pretty inaccurate, or are actually super inaccurate every time I've used them. So if even if the chat bots are inaccurate, I can't imagine how the disease forecasting ones are. But
they don't need to be accurate. I mean, it's an industry with a lot of overhype issues. And a lot of these companies that are the biggest AI companies, especially when it's like legacy big tech companies making them, like Google or Oracle or whatever, a lot of them have very deep national security connections from their origins on and are arguably fronts for those agencies. At which point you have to, they only really need the perception that the algorithm is accurate anyway. And I don't think, a lot of what you brought up earlier about like Ellison saying AI surveillance systems will have people be on their best behavior. The whole idea of the panopticon and all of that is the idea that, you're being watched constantly, but you don't know if you're being watched. So that induces obedience and quote unquote correct behavior. And so, they could, the idea that the algorithm is monitoring these things, even if it's not accurate, it can still, have a lot of the same consequences as long as people think it's accurate. And I think there's a lot of perception manipulation. I think that's pretty clear for the public. And a lot of it is trying to manage how the public feels about it. And having these sort of AI surveillance systems is meant to sort of have that kind of panopticon effect. I don't think they're really in these applications really meant to work very much, as an example, like law enforcement use of AI. In Britain, the Met Police had a contract with, I forget what company, but it was found to be notoriously inaccurate. They were using it for live facial recognitions of all sorts of public events in the UK. And it came out that it was like its accuracy was just dismal. And they made no effort to correct or change vendors. Why would that be? Because they don't care. Yeah. Right? I mean, because if they did care, they would obviously change vendors. There's no shortage of people selling that particular product. But the idea is that they're being watched, but it's important to point out too that they're also very racially biased. Which has I argued in my work in the COVID era, there was a lot of eugenics era people that have rebranded. Bill Gates became kind of infamous as a figure pushing policies analogous to that. And I think people should be pretty wary of that, especially when Palantir's evolved because of its history of racial bias and things like pre-crime, which they call predictive policing, and also in warp speed. And also people like Peter Thiel and Alex Karp's like complete obsession with race stuff. Like Alex Karp is like convinced that like white Americans are going to push him out of a high-rise building because he's half black and half Jewish. And he's like, I'm amazed I haven't been murdered by a different race yet. I don't think that sounds like a sane person that I want having this much power over our surveillance state and healthcare data. And that's going to have the power to segment populations and decide what quote unquote medical interventions they're prescribed by the state in some sort of national level health event or whatever. It's bonkers. Man, I feel like I'm ranting here, though. I mean, there's so much we could cover, and I think we're getting close to the time we usually wrap this podcast up. But is there anything else you'd like to note on any of these fronts, or any points or further reading you might want to recommend to viewers?
I would say that people should. I don't know if they can. Where they could get it, because I'm a unlimited Hangout premium member, so I got it. But the Solari report, AI Revolution, Final Coup d'etat by you. I think that is really interesting regarding this stuff that we're talking about, the bigger picture elements and the way that it's going to be sold to us versus the way that it actually works. Because you talk about how AI. You just give perfect example of how AI has these hallucinations, these insane inaccuracies. In my own experience, I've in my limited experience using these things, I remember I talked to some friends and they were saying, "Oh my God, ChatGPT is amazing. You can ask it anything and it gets it right every time." And I said, "Are you serious? Every time I've asked it something and I've fact checked it, it gets it wrong almost every single time." Like, for example, the other day I saw that Trump's new press secretary is named Caroline Leavitt. I was like, I wonder if she's related to Mike Leavitt. So I asked ChatGPT just to see what it would say. And it was like, yes, Mike Leavitt is Caroline Leavitt's father. I looked it up. No, that's not true. I said, that's not true. Oh, sorry, it's actually his niece. That's not true either. Oh, they're actually cousins. Not true. So you got it wrong like 5 times in a row on this basic question.
Yeah. Well, I think there are things that AI can probably do effectively. I've heard from people that it's quite good at coding, for example, and some other things. But obviously the code that it makes has to go back and be checked and audited like by a human and stuff. I don't know. I personally am. Well, I'm not a big AI evangelist. Quite the opposite, as people who follow my work closely would know. But I think the point here, whether you're an advocate or sort of a skeptic, is that a lot of the applications it's being pitched for at the law enforcement, national security level, and also in healthcare, the accuracy matters a lot there, especially because there's, if they don't really necessarily give it human oversight, which in a lot of these cases it's pretty minimal, I think. And as we're moving into the world of autonomous warfare and autonomous everything, will probably become, less human oversight as time goes on. I think people should be, very wary of that, and know that accuracy matters. And one thing I do want to add before we wrap up here, as it relates to mRNA stuff likely coming on the market in significant numbers over the next 4 years, if people want to push for something at the policy level that may actually end up happening, have products with mRNA in it be labeled, whether that's, meat that was injected, the animal was injected with mRNA while it was alive, like in the food supply or in the pharmaceutical system. I think people have a right to know. And so, if we can't necessarily, trust that it'll be kept the market, even with RFK in charge of HHS or something like that, I think there should be I think it would be kind of practical to push to have informed consent at the very least about what products have mRNA or genetic material and which ones do not.
Yeah, and RFK is actually one of his things that he's been pushing. I think more lately has been this right to know thing. So if the Trump campaign really or the Trump administration really does support RFK, then that shouldn't be a problem. But I kind of doubt it. But
Well, we'll see.
yeah, yeah, I kind of doubt it. But and yeah, I mean, I don't have much else to say. All I'll say is because I don't think we got to comment super in depth on the Center for Forecasting and Outbreak Analytics, but I would say the big picture read of that is that it's the resurrection of the biosurveillance elements of total information awareness and the entrenchment of it into a full center dedicated to carrying out this kind of biosurveillance to predict pandemics constantly. The entrenchment of that into our current public health agency and private academic apparatus. It's really resurrecting that and implementing it, and I think we'll see a concrete way eventually. It's going to. And the reason that that's important, it's pairing with total information awareness, is because the data that it taps is dual use. Like so much of this stuff, like you just mentioned how AI might be useful for some things, that might be true, but you have to look at the interest of the people that are implementing it and what they actually want to do and what their incentives are and ideologies are. And it just so happens that this biosurveillance data is just as useful for pre-crime purposes, which, as you mentioned, Palantir and Alex Karp and Peter Thiel just privatized as soon as Congress killed it. And so that's something to be wary of for anyone that might see this predictive health stuff as beneficial, because I understand why it's enticing. Like I know someone that has an Apple Watch and their heart slowed down and it automatically called an ambulance for them. And they said that their Apple Watch saved their life, right? I see why it's enticing, but those dual use elements that are very apparent if you look at the origins and the people involved have to be considered. So that's all I'd say.
Great. Well, I think those are great points to add. And I would also add, too, that, total information awareness needs to be seen for what it is. It is a neocon program that has been rebranded. This is like a neoconservative agenda that really goes back to the Reagan era in terms of the idea of using, this type of surveillance. And a lot of it, including the person that, ran total information awareness and is considered the godfather of modern surveillance, John Poindexter. He was one of actually the highest ranking member of the Reagan administration to be indicted as part of Iran-Contra. And Iran-Contra was trying to develop a similar surveillance program for the purpose of clamping down on domestic dissent in the event of a vaguely defined national emergency. And in the power of the state, this is not good. The government has misused this kind of power and this kind of data many times. To quote a former NSA and CIA director, Michael Hayden, we kill people with metadata. People need to be very careful about what kind of data you're willingly going to surrender over to the government. And when you're allowing them, insight into what your internal body is doing, and also in the case of your of the brain chip, what you're thinking. And it doesn't even have to go as far as a brain chip anymore, if you believe any of the some of the sales pitches of technology currently being touted. But I think we need to be really aware and cognizant. And it's someone for people that want to know the risks of this. Actually, a big tech beloved futurist, Yuval Noah Harari, made it quite clear how this could easily lead to the end, what he calls the end of free will and authoritarianism. That's just completely unprecedented, where the state can know, even if you're externally expressing one reaction to a policy or a politician, if you're internally showing a negative response, they can, as he says, send you to the gulag the next morning. That doesn't really sound very appealing to me. And not that it would happen overnight, but if we continue to be sort of coaxed into this complacency that all these big tech bros with ties to the national security state have our best interests at heart, when they're actually, sort of implementing these, this kind of overtly neoconservative agenda, I think there are definite dangers that come with that. So, Max, where can people follow your work?
Yeah, so I have Twitter, which